So, good evening, everybody. It's an immense pleasure for us at Open to organize this event. My name is Gagan Chhabra, and I'm going to speak on behalf of Open, Opportunities for Postdoc Equity and Networking. It's a group which is organizing this event and is duly supported by the Visiting Scholars Postdoc Affairs Office, as well as the Robert and Colin Haas Chair of Disability Studies. And I'm just so delighted, ecstatic is the right word, because here I am sitting with this stellar panel of people who come from different walks of life, and we will be discussing issue which is kind of a bit neglected when it comes to academic and political or social discourse. And the issue is disability, identity, history, and movement. So, a brief about myself. I am a visiting scholar here. I came from Norway, Oslo, in August 2018, and how this event came to be what it is, why you people are here. Back in October 2018, I got one of these long emails from the Visiting Scholars Postdoc Affairs Office, which talked about many events and many groups which are part of the Berkeley campus. And one of the group caught my attention. It was this Open group. So I contacted Iskra, and I asked her, Iskra, I would like to be part of this group, and I would like to meet you and talk about disability, because you are talking about diversity and inclusion and equity. And we ended up having this incredible conversation. Iskra, me, and Aditi, and Christopher joined in later in the whole conversation. And the idea was this, that at Open, we did not have that particular understanding that disability is part of diversity, because predominantly diversity was construed as gender diversity, LGBTQI inclusion of people from ethnic minorities and races. And I asked a simple question: where is disability in this conversation? And why is it not here? Because we are in Berkeley. We are on the West Coast, which was the birthplace of independent living movement. I talked at length about this gentleman, Jim, and his incredible movie, which is going to come next year. And I said that, won't it be nice if we kind of bring disability back to Berkeley, the conversation about disability, and we bring it back in a way which is not purely academic discussion, but it is something which is covering different aspects. It has the aspect of activism, culture, media, law, and academics. And Iskra, Aditi, and Christopher really liked the idea. And that's how the whole story moved up. And lo and behold, in January, the VSPA office gave us the funding. Later on, Karen Nakamura, who has actually invited me to come to Berkeley, said, Gagan, we want to be part of this whole thing as well. So it's from this one small innocuous idea to bring people from different walks of life to discuss an issue which is very important and often neglected. We are here. And I'm really honored, humbled, and privileged that this stellar panel is around me. So for instance, I'll start with Jim. Jim is an incredible movie maker. As I mentioned, he's going to come up with this movie. Sound designer. You can read all about him. Of course, he's going to talk about himself when he presents. We have Paul, who's in the queue. Sorry. Is that Paul?
Yes.
Yeah, you're Paul. Exactly. So Paul. So we have Paul, who has been this senior attorney with the Department of Education for more than 30 years. He has worked on the issue of access, equality, and accommodation for students with disabilities, and has worked in the Hastings University for almost 20 years. A notable speaker, has traveled the world. We have Denise Sherer Jacobson, who has been this incredible activist, has written a book called as The Question About David, giving her experiential insight of what it is to be a person with disability, and not just be a person with disability, but be a mother, raise a family, and be the wife of the incredible Neil Jacobson, who's there in the back. And then we have Lainey, who's going to present perspectives about She's a phenomenal lawyer, a wonderful human being. I got a chance to meet her last year and asked her about this event, and she agreed. She's worked with DREDF, the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, for 4 years. She was a litigation head from 1992 to 1996, and has come up with a book called A Structured Negotiation. So rather than disabled people, activists, going and confronting and suing the companies, let us get together, talk about issues, collaborate, and come to consensual decisions instead of filing lawsuits and engaging in this back and forth. That's what Lainey has worked with. So as you can see, there's this incredible eclectic mix of ideas, experience, and insights, which again, I'm really fortunate, and we all are very lucky to have all these people here. And yeah, I would invite Jim to talk about his upcoming movie, Crip Camp, which I'm really looking forward to see. Because think about this, that when you think of say a movement from 60s, 70s, 80s, you think of the anti-war movement about Vietnam, you think about the free speech movement, you think about the black civil rights movement intuitively, you think about the feminist wave. And often in all these different movements, one movement which is kind of very important gets a bit sidelined, and that's the disability rights movement. That how people with disabilities got a chance to become full and equal participants in the society, and how this whole process came about. It has been a phenomenal journey. So kind of people think about the 60s, 70s, and the popular imagery is of Woodstock. Jim is going to say, perhaps we should think about disabled people as well, or persons with disability, and what they were doing. Were they somehow different, or did they have same aspirations? And did they also wanted to be free and express their humanity and express free speech? So Jim, please.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. First off, Crip Camp is a feature-length documentary that we're in the middle of editing right now. I am a co-director, co-producer. The other director is a wonderful filmmaker, Nicole Noonan, who my history has been in sound mixing for documentaries for over 20 years. And I approached her about the idea of a story connected to the summer camp I went to, where Denise also went. And when we started talking about it, she said, I think we should make the film together, really as equals. So it's, certainly I'm in the film and talking about it, but Nicole and I are equal partners in this project, which is really, collaborations are always greater than the sum of the parts. Mm-hmm. So I'm really stoked about that. I could almost eat up like the next 2 hours kind of talking about things, which I really won't be that selfish. But here's the thing. I had felt for many years that a film about our camp and our community would be something really worthwhile for people to see, and that didn't want it to be lost to history. And my initial thought was, look, Camp Schned was a summer camp for the handicapped that had been going on in the Catskill Mountains for a number of years. I was a camper there starting in 1970, and in 1971, there wound up being a group of videographers that happened to come to the camp, wound up shooting 5.5 hours worth of black and white video, which we were able to help get transferred and licensed. I knew that there was a really cool story here, but initially it was just simply, there was this exodus of people out to Berkeley from the New York area. A bunch of us you were growing up where in the Bronx, and I was in Westchester and such. And I remember saying to you, Denise, that boy, it must have been really brave to move out to California, out from New York. And she said, what are you, crazy? It was like no freaking brainer, Jim. It's like, here's the CIL out here, there's no snow, it's relatively condensed community, and okay, so there's my ableism, thank you very much. And so the idea behind Crip Camp is to kind of show how within a unique summer camp, where they really treated us not as patients, not as burdens, but as people that they wanted to facilitate them feeling good about themselves, but not in some kind of artificial way. But like, your life is anything possible. You're here to have a really good summer. But inherent in all of that was raising expectations, and as I think Neil Jacobson said, kick our ass, right? So, and indeed this happened, but it was a product of the times. That when Larry Ellison started running this camp, and the people that were there, that there was this real sense of looking at the time in history with all these different liberation movements. And we were completely wiping away old rules and making new rules, and it should apply to the people at this camp. Well, we had a tight community. So what is it like after being there for 2 months, and you go back home and, you know, you're up a flight of stairs, you know, all of us are all of a sudden dealing with architectural and attitudinal barriers, that we were in this wonderful bubble for 2 months. And kind of the thesis of the film, or what we're trying to portray, is that once you experience a better life, you'll do anything to capture that back again and protect it and cultivate it and grow it. And that this is really a universal story. It's not just about disability. If anybody winds up being treated with respect and love where they're not getting it before, they're going to say, I want more of that. And the fact of the matter is that if this is a really great basis to look at the disabled independent living movement and the disabled civil rights movement, because people like Judy Heumann and Denise and a bunch of other people were involved in demonstrations right kind of from the get-go. And really, it's kind of like dropping this stone this is my latest beautiful analogy for all of this, but it's applicable for things where, you know, you drop a stone in still water, you see all these waves coming out from there. So us knowing about Judy Heumann, who had successfully sued the New York City Board of Education for a teaching position post-polio, made us realize that we could actually fight back and win. And then it was kind of like, if you jump forward there were various demonstrations going on in New York, the establishment of Disabled in Action, what was going on out here, that basically we didn't have to take the status quo. And every kind of victory, like HEW 504 and stuff, was just another bigger rock into that pond saying, we are capable of doing this. And so what I'd like to do is show you our sizzle reel that we did about 1.5 years ago. So it's been a lot of work since then, but it kind of gives you the idea of where we were going with this film. Fair enough?
Yes, absolutely.
Want to dim the lights? I'm going to get out of the way.
Black and white video of early 1970s portable video equipment.
I'm recording now.
It's a little
I
loud.
want to shut it off. I got to press the trigger again.
A teenage wheelchair user.
Would you like to see handicapped people depicted as people?
Excuse me?
Home movie of disabled preschooler Jim Lebrecht climbing up an end table and onto a dresser.
I was born in 1956 with spina bifida.
He waves and smiles at the camera.
They told my parents that I wasn't going to live more than a couple of hours. I had a different idea.
Smiling, he slides down the stairs, head first.
The expectations for me and people like me were very low. We were perceived as people who were helpless, pitiful, and wouldn't amount to very much at all.
A montage shows him growing up.
Disability was something to be ashamed of. It was something horrible.
He visits Mexico and dives into a pool.
Kids like me were being shipped off to institutions.
Grainy footage of a man draped in an American flag.
1969, the summer of Woodstock. Some friends told me about a camp. Imagine a summer camp for the disabled run by hippies. It was even rumored that you could smoke dope with the counselors.
Stan, you're the director here.
Yeah, I bought the director of the camp, and I decided to dig a few holes because kids are kind of clumsy, and I thought it'd be funny if they tripped.
A diverse group of campers and young counselors pal around. Teen campers mug for the camera, waving and giving peace signs. On a grass field, laughing campers and counselors crawl around, kicking and rolling a volleyball.
At the camp, it was this bubble of freedom. You could do anything that you thought you wanted to try to do. You wouldn't be picked to be on a team back in New York. But at Jened, you had to go up to bat. And if you didn't hit the ball, hell, you were out.
Counselors and campers play softball. Inside, a bearded, long-haired man bangs on a TV.
We are the People's Video Theater. Any ideas you have in terms of how to use the equipment, let us know. Let's have a lot of interaction and see if we can make a program together about, this camp.
Cameras roll and interviews begin at camp.
You know, like when you see these movies on TV, like the Martians are invading, or the crabs are invading.
You can't see them, that's the problem.
Besides crabs, we have a few cases of clams down here. We're thinking of collecting all the crabs and having a bake.
A camper in a wheelchair smokes a cigarette.
I would like to have somebody wash your balls. People around here feel small enough most of the time. And when somebody has to scrub their balls, they'll probably feel even smaller.
Photo montage. A guy poses in sandals and a diaper. People having fun, smoking cigarettes and flipping off the camera. The first year I was at camp, one of the women counselors gave me a whole lesson on how to kiss. And I gotta tell you, that was one of the best physical therapies I ever had. Next to him, his wife laughs.
Have to catch it and find yourself,
Nancy, a teenage wheelchair user.
Well, two people got crabs
And I met my first girlfriend there. And I remember spending at least half the summer lip-locked with Nancy. I mean, I can't believe they didn't put a hose on
Jim Lebrecht at 15. Lionel, a black counselor.
When we were at Jened, the Disability Act had not been passed. So when we would take you guys or the campers on a trip into town for ice cream, we couldn't get you in the door. And then deal with the staring, or deal with, we don't want them here because it made our other customers feel uncomfortable. That was familiar to me. Because try going to a restaurant in the South before segregation was over.
There's tremendous value in bringing joy to people's lives for however long or short that lasts.
So you want to be on your own?
Being able to tell her mother that she was going to be moving out was probably just such a really great feeling for her to do that. She experienced freedom and independence for the short time that it worked.
I think my mother still feels I'm the 5-year-old kid that she had 10 years ago. And so it's totally ridiculous.
But don't you think in a way it's better to have your parents feel that way than to have them just give you up like some parents do?
Some of us would begin to discuss the barriers that we face on a day-to-day basis. We were a sounding board to each other, and I think that was a time where we helped empower each other that the status quo is not what it needed to be.
A montage of outdoor activity and indoor partying. We had friends. Some of us fell in love. Some of us got our hearts broken. And nobody overprotected us. We found out that even though we had disabilities, we were human like everyone else.
A number of people from our camp got very politically active. This is what was unleashed.
We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We will accept no more discussion of segregation. The outrage of disabled individuals across the country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. There will be more takeovers of buildings.
The fact of the matter is you don't have anything to strive for if you don't know that it exists. And what we saw at that camp was that our lives could be better.
Campers mature alongside the disability rights movement, experiencing graduations, parenthood, sit-ins, and the Capitol crawl. Trump mocks reporter with disability. Capitol Police carry adapt protesters away from their sit-in. Words appear in white letters on a black background. Crip Camp, not overcoming, becoming.
That's a nice round of applause. I apologize for not having captioning on that. I'm not quite sure what I screwed up there, but and storylines are changed, and a lot of things have happened in the over a year since this was put out. But it's been a really great tool to attract funding and such. And we're trying to keep the film a little bit under the radar. So if you know, on social media wise, if you maybe not mention the title of the film, but outside of that, everything's kosher because we are planning on finishing the film this year, and we're we're shooting for the stars, and hoping that we might premiere at Sundance next year. I mean, I'm going to shut up right after this. Hand in hand with really bringing our community's legacy of activism and striving for a chosen life, which I think is really what it's about. There's also a part of this with being a filmmaker with an obvious disability that's helping to really kind of open up some doors so that other folks with disabilities are going to have an easier time. There have been some wonderful filmmakers in the documentary world like Jason Da Silva and Jennifer Brea who've really knocked down some doors, and I've been trying to obliterate the ones that were left in their wake. So anyway.
Yeah. So you got a flavor of why I fell head over heels for this man and this movie. I met him serendipitously at SF Film Festival. I got a chance to go there because of Victor Pineda, who works here. Yeah, exactly. Cheers for Victor, absolutely. So, and as you saw in the movie, the themes are pretty strong. That we are first people, we are first human. The idea of love is not only for this quote unquote non-disabled majority. Love is love. It is for everybody. Even disabled people have a right to fall in love, to have education, to get employment, to have families. So this whole activism spirit is captured by our next co-panelist, Denise, one of the stars of the movie. Yes. So get ready. After the event, you could take her signature and like autographs and everything, pictures with her. Sure. So Denise, please, could you just tell us all how the society was at that moment, in 70s and 80s, in your experience, like what kind of barriers were there, and how did you overcome them? East Coast.
Then I began coming to in 1966, and for those of us who grew up in that time, the severity of you witness animals, you kind of loud and visible, like people didn't want to see you or hear you or know anything about you. And because there was take a look at a little bit of it. Lauren,
Yes.
would you read it?
Yes.
Sure.
After lunch, John sat waiting for me in the shade of the bandstand so we could share some brief moments together before I had to go off to a camper council meeting. My bunkmates had elected me to represent our G4 bunk at once-a-week meeting at rest hour with Larry, the teen camp division unit head, to supposedly air our grievances and work to resolve issues, like petitioning for more free time in teen camp. I was honored to be chosen, until now. Does she really have to go? John besieged my counselor Jill with a disappointed frown when she came to get me. He had just stopped running his fingers gently up and down my bare thigh as we sat face to face. His light touch felt so soothing, yet so exciting at the same time. It didn't even tickle. Afraid so, Jill answered, determined to have me keep my commitment. John and I clasped hands as Jill backed me away in my manual wheelchair. Summers ago, when I went to Camp Corolla, the roving reporter for the camp newspaper would go around asking the girls what famous actress they'd like to be. Usually the girls picked some popular ingenue, Sandra Dee, Carol Lindley, Natalie Wood, Yvette Mimo. I never could come up with someone on my own, so I'd always respond with a name I'd overheard from another camper. I'd get called copycat a lot. But in truth, I didn't want to be anybody else, actress or otherwise. I liked being myself. I just wanted people to see me, who I really was. Not only a body with cerebral palsy, but someone attractive, with a heart, mind, and soul, and a sexy soul at that. John was the somebody who finally recognized the real me. Nice.
So, thank you, Denise, for sharing this very grounded and intimate story from your past, because the point which Denise raises is a very important point, that what is disability? Is it the impairment? The moment you think about disability, should you just think of impairment? In the academic terms, it's the medical model of disability, the individualization of disability, the essentialization of disability, the grounding of disability in the person. Or is it the fact that the society has created barriers which has kind of excluded a lot of us from participating in the market, or in the society, or in communities? So thanks, Denise, for sharing this very important perspective that we have to kind of see ourselves as human first, full of potential. Yeah. Lainey, if I might come to you from a legal standpoint, because activists can lobby, can work hard, can have sit-ins, but how was the situation when it comes to, from a legal point of view, legal perspective, for disabled people back in 60s, 70s, and 80s, and has it evolved? Could you just talk a bit about what were the key highlights from the past 3 decades or 4 decades?
In my 4 minutes?
Yes, please. That'll be great.
Okay, first of all, I just have to thank Gagan for bringing us together. I mean, he's only been here since August. And it's like people who I love and I never get to see, and here we are all in a room. So thank you, and to Karen, and to all his sponsors. And like,
Thank you.
Yeah. And to Jim, oh my God, I was in a different camp in those same years with those same songs and those same, as a non-disabled person. And I just look at that and say, wow, we were so segregated. I was 8 years at a summer camp, and I don't think there was a disabled person at the camp or we ever talked about. And so law, I mean, oh my God, the movie and your love story and law, So I'm not quite sure how to segue, except to say that the work that the campers did as they grew up and became activists led us to be a country where we have civil rights laws that protect disabled people. And we have Section 504, which is basically about, you know, we have a federal government. If it's going to spend money, it has to spend it on everybody. It can't just spend it on some people and not others. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act. You saw the Capitol Crawl in the movie. And what happens, and let me just say something about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I'm a disability rights lawyer. I work with blind people on technology issues. And I do it in a way of collaboration, like Gagan said. And listening to you, especially Denise, what you said, that I like to work in collaboration in enforcing the ADA, because the companies I work with, like I've done agreements with Bank of America and Walmart on their technology, make sure disabled people are included, specifically blind people. And in collaboration, companies get to see people, and they get to hear people, and they get to understand people. And when you're just in a traditional law, confrontational setting, people are wearing hats, and their own selves don't get to come out. And so especially in disability rights, when we're enforcing and trying to keep alive the spirit of laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which started, really, I used to have various theories of where it started. Now I'm going to say it started at Camp Jeanette. You know, we want to keep the people in it, and too often law takes the people out of the story. So it's about stories. I brought two props. I knew we were having a movie, so I said, I'm going to bring something. So the first thing I have to show is a stamp that says, "Don't believe the Braille." And this is a stamp that was used by a friend of many of ours, Josh Mealy, who's not here right now, because now ATMs all over the country talk. So blind people can have independent access to their money by plugging a headset jack into the ATM and hearing. But before that, the banking industry put Braille on all the ATMs. But Braille wasn't effective as a communication device on an ATM because the ATM is interactive. So Josh, who's a brilliant scientist and an inventor and now works at Amazon, he had these stamps made up, "Don't believe the Braille," and he would go in the dark of night and stamp them on the screens of ATMs in Berkeley, California. And when I published my book, where I tell the story of how we worked with the banks and how the banks got to know blind people, and they were willing, we got some of the first talking ATMs, we got websites so blind people could do their own banking. It's because the banks got to know blind people as people. And before they were working with blind people, and they were just thinking, oh, we have to enforce this new law, the ADA, let's put Braille on the ATMs. So don't believe the Braille. So that's the ATM story. When we were able to bring blind people together with ATM manufacturers and financial institutions, they got it immediately, because we had people like Kathy Martinez, who many of you know, and Kim Charlson in Boston, and many, many blind people, early technology adopters, who traveled the world for work, had professional careers, and they couldn't get $20 of their own money out of the ATM. So that's how my career started, and I have many, many experiences like that. And the thing to remember, I told Gagan, I said, can I use this quote that I love? Oh, I don't. Do I have a piece of paper? Yes. Can we ever think of disability rights in line with one of my favorite quotes, which is from a guy named Hakuin Ekaku. Do any of you know him? He's a famous Japanese Zen master from way back in the day, 1686. How long ago was that? Like 400 years ago? 1686?
Yeah, 400 some years. 430.
In singing and dancing is the voice of the law. And when we remember that laws like the ADA and Section 504 and all these laws we're talking about civil rights so people can be seen, heard, and understood. And that's singing and dancing. So that's what I try to do, and that's what the law can be, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, Lainey has talked about this issue of accessibility, especially for blind people. Just to put things into a bit of perspective, not far in history, perhaps in 50s and 60s, if a blind man is walking or a blind woman is walking on the street in California, and if he or she gets hit by a car, it was the onus of the blind man and blind woman. Why did they leave the house? The person who hit these persons, blind people, would be acquitted of any crime. That was the situation, wherein, you know, the level of sensitivity towards what blindness is, how to deal with blind people, can they participate in the society as equal citizens, was just not there. And of course, Lainey mentioned briefly about 504. I would invite Paul to jump into this, Paul, this idea about disability rights as civil rights, and how, for instance, 504 got played out in the university setting, because university is a public institution and it gets money from the state, federal state.
So you have a historical point in the law which underscores a point Lainey was making, which is that there is not a separate, segregated body of law, disability law. When I teach disability law, it always bothers me that my students come to my class, and they're mostly either individuals with disabilities or frustrated special ed teachers or individuals who have a brother or sister who are individuals with disabilities, and it kind of disappoints me that they don't get that without civil rights laws on race and national origin and gender, there would be no disability law. That we are one continuous body of law. And I'm going to turn to maybe the single most significant link between race and national origin law and disability law, in part because I had a personal attachment to it. So here we have the San Francisco Unified School District, you know, right across the bridge. And in Chinatown, San Francisco, is a school in those days full of monolingual Cantonese-speaking students. And my office, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, sued San Francisco for failing to address the needs of those children. And the San Francisco Unified School District, even then a fairly liberal, self-enlightened body, said, wait a minute, that Chinatown school gets more money per student than the kids do up in the rich heights. Their teachers are just as experienced. We paint their walls just as often. Their playgrounds have just as new materials. How can it be that we are discriminating against them, right? And the San Francisco office, the Office of Civil Rights, said, wait a minute, you're not taking into account a fundamental difference that these children come to the starting line with. And the fundamental difference is they don't speak English. And unless you address this fundamental difference, you are discriminating against them on the basis of national origin. And the school board's position is identical treatment is equal treatment. And the position of the department was sometimes identical treatment is discriminatory treatment. And I have a very personal attachment to this case because I helped prepare the Solicitor General of the United States for his argument before the Supreme Court on this issue. And I went and watched the argument. And then, of course, we all sat on pins and needles waiting for the decision. So the decision came, and the decision was it might not be unconstitutional to fail to treat these students differently, but the Department of Education may enforce its laws to conclude that identical treatment is not always equal treatment. And understand that's the key change in the law that allowed us to come up with the concept of reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification. And until we had this precedent, right, we could not progress to the next point. And for me, then, the further exciting point was that by happenstance, I was moved to San Francisco. Actually, that was my quid pro quo for not leaving the department. I was moved to San Francisco just in time for the 504 sit-in. And the reason that's significant is 504 is just 35 words long. It essentially just says, if you receive federal financial assistance, you will not discriminate on the basis of disability. And understand, other than a school that says no person with a disability need apply, the law was of no value. It had no force. We couldn't apply it, right? There was nothing illegal about not accommodating an individual. There was nothing illegal about not having a ramp, right? So we needed the regulation. And it was the regulation that came up with this concept. The people who had done Lau v. Nichols, which is the San Francisco case, were the same people who were writing those regulations, right? And when they wrote into those regulations the concept of reasonable accommodation, we still had to get the regulation adopted. And the 504 sit-in that your movie was about, you know, that this included the camp led to the 504 sit-in, that was the essential step to having regulations which meant something, which was the first step to our rights. And just so you know, the ADA as a statute is the 504 regulations. That's essentially the ADA, is they took the 504 regulations and they made it into a statute. So in my 4 minutes and 48 seconds, let me just wrap up, which is that there is one great body of civil rights law, and individuals with disabilities are an essential part of that continuum. And therefore, when I work so hard with educating faculty at institutions of higher education, like Cal Berkeley, the thing I'm trying to pound through their head is, we too are part of the civil rights movement. We too are part of the civil rights history. And all the arguments, and I'll talk about this later, for diversity, for example, pertain to us just as much as anyone else. But we would not have our rights had people before us not struggled on the basis of race, color, national origin.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll vote for you.
So the most important thing which I would like to highlight from an outsider's point of view, for a person who was born in India and now is living and working in Norway, Oslo, is this idea that this civil rights tradition that you cannot discriminate against a person based on the fact that they are disabled. You cannot discriminate against a person based on the fact of their gender or LGBTQI. This concept has become global. It's no longer restricted to the American Constitution base, or it's no longer part of only American jurisprudence. Countries as different as India or Mozambique or Fiji or Jordan have come up with civil rights legislation. So I think that the fire which was started at Crip Camp has kind of ignited the world, and it's kind of been the sun, you know, which has brought warmth and love and equality and fairness and justice to people with disabilities around the world. So that's very, very important. So moving on, because this is a very important aspect which you mentioned, Paul, about building coalitions, about race and gender and other civil rights. Jim and Denise, if I may ask you, how did you mobilize and kind of build bridges with disabled people? Because, you know, disability movement could be considered really fractured. There could be a lot of interests, or people would say that I don't belong to this part of the movement. How did you, at that moment when you were at the camp, kind of bridge the gap and collaborated with each other? If you could reflect upon it, Jim first, and then Denise, you.
I mean, I think the thing about being in community at a camp like Jeanette is that, and you know, I learned a lot simply by being there. I wasn't, you know, 10 months out of the year, I was the only person with a disability in my grade school, and I wasn't really part of the community. But what you learn there as going there is the amount of respect that everybody's giving each other, the amount of respect people are given if they have some kind of a speech impediment to finish their sentences. I don't think slack is quite the right word for it, but basically, you know, give everybody the due respect, the respect that they are due. And that, I think that kind of carries on. In one of our interviews with Corbett O'Toole for the film, you know, she said, you know, we have this diverse group of people inside at the 504, and I may not really understand what it's like to live with your disability, but if you tell me you need this, then out of hand, I believe you. And I think that kind of amount of respect for someone's, you know, intelligence and where they're coming from, and mutual respect was really kind of instilled simply naturally there. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah. Denise.
It was also a product of the time. It was the time of the anti-war movement, the time of civil rights, the time of the women's movement. A lot of people who worked at the camp who were not disabled were worried about the draft, about going to Vietnam. So we were exposed to ideas from all different perspectives, and they were really radical. And so we began to identify what oppression was, that if other people were oppressed, maybe we were too. And so I think that was a spark of identifying with what was going on around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I saw the trailer and when I interacted with you and Denise, one thing which I kind of gathered was it was this zeitgeist or the times, the spirit of the times, as you mentioned, Denise, about people wanting to collaborate, people wanting to build bridges, fight for common causes, because there were a lot of people who were oppressed back in that time, and they kind of expanded the plank, if you will. So talking about from a legal point of view, both Paul and Lainey, you talked about 504 and ADA. Like this concept of disability has kind of been expanded over the course of years. Could you reflect upon that, like how it was, for instance, like impairment centric, and then it kind of became this evolving concept which changes with the changing times? Lainey, first to you.
So you know, I think we're at a really interesting point in disability history, and there's a language debate going on which reflects the point we're at, and so I want to just comment on that as an insight into your question. I had a friend who just competed for a position of Disabled Student Services Director at a major university. And my friend is deaf, my friend is post-polio, and when she competed for the position, she almost didn't get a second interview because it offended greatly the interview panel that she did not use person-first language. She used disability-first language, right? And fortunately, we found out this was what upset the panel, and we immediately sent the panel citation to 8 articles on why disability first language may be acceptable.
Yes.
But the point right now for the disability community is, how visible do we want to be? How much do we want to define ourselves? Disability first, personhood first, maybe, you know, mix it up. I use personhood first out of habit,
Yes.
more than anything else. But as an individual with an invisible disability, which is why you invited me, right?
Yes.
For me, it's a particularly challenging question, because on the one hand, I can pass,
Yes.
right? I can pass, just like a light-skinned African-American person might pass. But on the flip side of it is, you don't know me, you don't understand me, you don't have insights into me until you know that I have an invisible disability, right? And I actually, as you know, Guy, and I have 3 disabilities, but the only one that affects me actually is not my cancer, is not my diabetes, but my dyslexia, you know? Because that's what determined how I went through life, right? That's what that's what gives me the fire in my belly, right? That you all here today, that, you know, you first heard is one more reason why you contacted me. You heard the fire in my belly.
Yes.
My disability is what gives me the fire in my belly. So until you know my disability, you don't know why I have my fire, right? And that same identity issue is now, you know, right on the edge for every individual with a disability in America and eventually in the world. How much do I want to identify as an individual with a disability, right? And if I'm going to identify, when and how, is it going to be a source of pride for me, or am I going to hide it because I won't get hired as an attorney if people know I have dyslexia? And it's a critical question at this very moment.
That's right.
I had a similar story. I do a lot of public speaking and webinars, and I got an evaluation that this woman should not be allowed to talk about disability rights in public because she hasn't learned about people first language. And I'm active on social media, and I try to stay current, and I have, as a public speaking person and a writer, I personally use it interchangeably, disabled person, person with disabilities, because I think we're at a moment in history where people are using both with pride. So there's that. One other thing to throw into the mix is that, like Paul said, from the legal perspective, disability builds on the civil rights struggles of everyone else. There's also so much intersection. You know, there's intersection. Every group has people with disabilities in it.
Yes.
And so you're starting to see some of the advocacy, like there's a woman who's going to be speaking at San Francisco State next week, Tia Lewis. I don't know if any of you guys are in the city. I really recommend her. She works on black deaf prisoners and does amazing advocacy around that. There's a real intersection, because we all know the statistics of people of color in prison is through the roof. Imagine deaf prisoners. And then the school to prison pipeline. There's legal issues around, you know, we all know that the percentage, I don't have the numbers, but we know generally that the percentage of young people in the juvenile justice system, a very high percentage have disabilities. So if people aren't given services in school, I know we have some special ed teachers here who do that important work, then they're in that pipeline. And so there's a lot of crossover, and DREDF, I think, has a litigation going on now between, you know, you're not just the identity in the law, you could have several of the identities. And some of this work and the crossover, I think, is some of the most cutting edge. And the other thing to say is about the Americans with Disabilities Act and trying to use it as a, you know, like you said, love or dance or song, words that we tend to put outside the legal system, when really the legal system is creating a structure for society. All those things should be part of it. And the ADA has proven amazingly resilient, because it was passed in 1990. All my work is about making sure websites and mobile applications and other technology can be used by people who don't have hands, or people who are blind, or people who don't have captions. And the ADA is our foundation to do that work, even though in 1990 there was no web for most of us. So that's really a testament to the Capitol crawlers and the people, you know, you can always look at something with glass half full, glass empty. I would have done this. Enforcement should be that. Meanwhile, we have a law passed in 1990 that gives people civil rights to information, validity, and reality in 2019. That's pretty impressive.
Gagan, I'll wait my turn again, but I just want to raise one point because of what Lainey said.
You're not waiting your turn.
Give me 15 seconds and I'll shut up.
I'm joking.
Okay.
12.
You got it. I'm watching the clock. One of the most important points that individuals with disabilities are facing in the concept of intersectionality is how much do we want to be part of the concept of diversity, right? And in the law, diversity is an extremely important concept, a very powerful concept. And it's evident to all the scholars that I work with in higher ed that they're very clear about the contribution to diversity made by people of color and minority people and people who are gay, but they are still slow to accept and understand that people with disabilities are also part of diversity. And that's unfortunate because the diversity argument is a very, very compelling and important one.
Yeah. There were, thanks Paul for that one, by the way. There were a couple of very interesting ideas which as you heard Paul and Lainey discuss about this idea of identity, the person first or the disabled person aspect, which there's this incredible split, if you will, from the British side and the American side. So those who are aware of the academic literature, they know that if you go to Britain, the predominant usage of the word is disabled person or disabled people. Or in Europe, it's a very common terminology. But the moment you come on the other side of the pond in the United States, it's the person first language, because and both those arguments have very serious reasons and for it and against it. So I would invite you to read more about it if you're curious about it, and also this aspect of intersectionality, which is very, very important from like the way a person who is of an ethnic minority background, LGBTQI, gender based. The way, and if they are disabled, they experience disability oppression in a much different light than a person who would be privileged in any given society. So those are some ideas to chew upon. So moving on, like if we could talk about very, very briefly, what each one of you, what do you think are would be like one most important challenge which disability movement is facing at this point in our in 2019, because we have reflected a lot on the past, and what that challenge is, and how do you think it could be resolved? So Jim, should I start with you, please?
Why not? I think that this whole discussion around diversity and inclusion, people with disabilities have been excluded for the most part, and it's and I was saying to my wife Sarah that, you know, it's just I think people are really uncomfortable talking with and people with disabilities and stuff. And she said, you'd be lucky if that was the case. It's just not on people's radar. And so, and this absolutely doesn't detract from the important work of diversity when it comes to all the everything from, you know, sexual parity and people of color and everything. But the fact that we're not in that discussion is really important, and that you have to get into the room first to be able to raise your hand to say, by the way, you're skipping over my community. We're kind of like 25% of the population. Could we just talk about this? And I think that once confronted with the fact that people aren't thinking about it or they're not working on it, and you're actually telling them that they're not, that it's fairly persuasive. I think the other issue that kind of goes hand in hand with that is people aren't willing to identify necessarily. And I'm not to, so I became a member of the Motion Picture Academy. Big deal. And I went down to this new members thing down in Los Angeles last year. And I happened to talk to the woman that's involved with membership, and I talked to her briefly about these things. She says, there's such stigma around disability that we can't develop numbers if people aren't willing to identify. And in fact, in talking to Susan Henderson, who's the executive director of DREDF, it's saying, look, if more people really identified, we'd have a much stronger voting bloc. It would be a lot better for all of us. So, but you have to get rid of stigma. There's a lot of work to be done, and that's why I choose to work in entertainment, because it is a way to get in people's inside their doors without them really knowing that you've done it. And
you're sneaky.
Yeah, in reality, a friend of mine is a comedian. She said, if you have a sitcom with disability, it allows people to stare at you from the comfort of their own home, and it's not a bad thing.
Denise, what do you think is the single most important challenge of our times?
I think there is a hierarchy within the disability community, and I would like people to take a look at that in the are we excluding people? Are we allowing people with speech impairment to be part of our group? Sometimes I feel that we still exclude each other. So if we exclude each other, how can we expect the rest of society to include us if we discriminate?
Yes, absolutely. Like if we discriminate, how can we expect society to include us? Lainey, on that note, please.
I have two things. One is kind of related to the idea of hierarchy, which is siloing. Everything's siloed. People just talk to each other, or like even within the disability community, people tend to talk to their people who think like they do, or who share a disability, or the people working on employment, diversity aren't necessarily thinking about technology that's needed to create that. So I'm a big believer in breaking down silos if possible. Another challenge I see is, sadly, in my own profession, where the popular culture, I wish I was an entertainer and could make movies. The popular culture likes to hear about lawsuits. You hear about lawsuits, or there's this many lawsuits in my space of digital. There's 3,000 lawsuits filed last year, which takes the people out of disabled people, wherever you put the adjective, and just makes it's an irony of the law, because the law is strong, people want to use it to enforce, and then the law, most way it's used, takes the people out of the people using the law. And so how can we use the law this is something I try to write about and I struggle with. How do we use it in a positive way to create inclusion and break down silos without labeling everyone who uses the law as somebody who's just in it to, take advantage and make money? So, yeah.
Paul?
So I think the number one issue facing the disability community is failure of the public to perceive how much work there is left to do for us to achieve equality. And I could talk to you literally for an hour with statistics, but I'm just going to give you 3 if you don't mind. So one is 33 states graduate less than 7% of their students with disabilities. Only 8% of individuals with disabilities have achieved a BA degree or higher. 86% of post-secondary students with psychiatric disabilities withdraw before they complete their college education. Our unemployment rate is double that of the public as a whole. As to incarceration, to me this is the saddest one. About 3 in 10 prisoners report having a cognitive disability. 30%. What an inhumane society we must be for this to go on. Now, what I take from that is this: nothing about us without us, right?
Yep.
The anthem of the American disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. If we don't get individuals with disabilities into higher education, graduated with degrees, these conditions are not going to change or improve. And the irony of all of this to me as an educator is this: everything we do to accommodate individuals with disabilities is an engine for innovation in higher education. And if we adopted universal design approaches and solutions to educating these students, not only would individuals with disabilities benefit, but so too would people whose first language is other than English. So too would visiting students, right? It would be the tide that would raise all boats. So we are shooting ourselves in the foot when we don't move in this direction. And Lainey, I think the answer to your question is universal design. I think that is the best way to effectuate this change.
Fantastic. So, as you see, like the plethora of perspectives about disability, you know, Jim mentioned about the fact that, you know, one of the major problems is that we are not even in the room. We have to kind of raise the voice and say, here we are, let's have the conversation about diversity and let us be part of it. Denise talking about the fact that there's this hierarchy, and if we exclude ourselves, if we discriminate against each other, like if we create a hierarchy, then how is the society going to appreciate and include us? And Lainey and Paul talking about this idea of inclusion and universal design. This is so important that here we are with all these people coming from different walks of life. Jim coming from this cultural aspect, representation, wherein we have encountered this aspect of stigma, devaluation, and lack of voice. Denise coming from the aspect of activism from the bottom up. Lainey coming from the aspect of law. We are breaking silos, and Paul coming from this aspect of higher education. I think I would say I am extremely fortunate, and I'm so happy that you people all showed up for this event. Let us join our hands together for all this wonderful panelists, and thank you, everybody. This conversation is just the beginning. It's the first step, and let us have some more conversations now. Anybody has any questions? I don't see, so you'll have to ask straight away. Don't raise hands or anything. Please, just shoot.
I have a question over here.
Yes, please.
It's Hester. I met you at the breakfast that we had in San Francisco.
Hi.
Thank you for the invitation. Bear with me as I'm trying to think this through. It's kind of for you, Jim and Denise. So I'm really excited to see the finished film and learn more about the story. I wasn't born yet back then. So it's really cool to see, you know, how all of the intersection of, you know, what you guys experienced and everything with the camp. My question involves where we are now in 2019 and how you guys view what that camp was at that time and how important that was for where we were as a society and getting that movement started. Now, where we are with things, I'm just going to say it, like the Tim Tebow Night to Shine events, where it's an event that's offered for and how it's advertised and marketed as an opportunity for people with disabilities that get left out of their prom and not invited to go and have this night where they can all, you know, get together and dance. And without trying to get, I don't know, I waver between like, okay, yes, it's a great experience, and I'm sure a lot of the folks that go have fun, but now in 2019, what is our responsibility with community integration and inclusion to, like, I think about an event like that and I'm like, okay, Tim Tebow with all his money, couldn't he go into schools and help educate kids in schools on making sure the prom is inclusive for everybody all the time, so we don't have to have a separate prom for people with disabilities, which feels exclusionary. So, you know, and there's also a lot of camps now that are designed for people with disabilities to go and have an experience. And so without trying to say that one thing is bad or good, or there's a right or a wrong way to do things, like where do you feel like we are now, and how do those things, I don't know, play into our society in times right now?
The age-old debate of segregation and inclusion, Jim.
Right.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
This is such a $1 million
question. It is a long game. First off, any social movement is a very long game. I guess the positive thing about Tim Tebow's thing is that, you know, without coming off as being cold-hearted, some of us in the disability community can point out why it may be a nice gesture, but it's sending the wrong message. And so it gives us an opportunity to talk about that. And boy, you know, it's a whole question of inspiration porn and media and videos. Gee, you know, we gave Billy an award for showing up at school for the whole year, and it's like, well, in other words, a goal that you wouldn't, or award you wouldn't give somebody if they were able-bodied. And so these are all kind of new concepts as we are being more and more part of media that we are able to talk to people about. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we've definitely had some strides, but that there still is all of this work still is yet to be done. And I don't know if I could be more eloquent than that, but I think it's a good question.
So, Denise.
I go back and forth about, you know, segregation and inclusion. I think what I got out of going to camp Sunday was a feeling that I belong, that there's somewhere I belong, and I think the trick is to help society make room so that everybody feels like they belong. And it is a long road.
I think mainstream is an elusive ideal which we are trying to reach out to. So that's a very, very important question, for sure. Other questions, please?
The question, not too sure, this is Helen, how to frame it. I'm a colleague with you all, but I'm from an area where I was in broadcasting during the digital transition. My goal outside of the educational institution was to try to bring in diversity initiatives during the digital transition. I was in the engineering department in PBS, and I worked with KQED Jeff Clark on the celebration of disability culture behind the scenes. I out with a hidden disability, out as GLBTQ at my station in a job that was engineering. I was the only woman in the engineering department. What I discovered within there, through Beth Howler, Susan Levine, National Organization of Disability, I'm very familiar with you, James, but I'm somebody that's been there all along, just in a capacity of working within the framework of a station to educate within, to outreach with my technical background, to start gauging where we're going to go with the new social media and digital transitioning, because PBS and KQED had no idea what would open up, neither did most in society. With that said, now I'm going to bring this here locally. Here we are. It's smart cities. I find myself in a different position. I'm here in local areas of government in the Bay Area, trying to say, hey, disability community, we need to be part of this. Lainey, I'll throw this to you. We have kiosks rolling out potentially in spring in Berkeley, and from all I know, from what I reviewed of the person who came in to talk to us, was it's not accessible, and I claimed that. These are informative here in Berkeley, and the concept of it, I didn't get enough information also with my background to say, well, you're not going to have audio on it. How can it be interactive for persons with disabilities? You know, that was sort of where it is. So how do we bring in our community? We're talking about silos here. How do we bring in our community now locally, where people can understand the different positions that people took within the community? I'm not known in the community, but I know most all of you in the community. But I put myself in that position because of the digital transition, and I had a background, and I also came with a background in media from the women's community, sound engineering and documentary, and music industry. So that's why I put myself there. And I've always been the hidden disability one who never was quite fit in with the disability community because I didn't have a name for my disability. I have a name now for it. But back then, nobody really knew what was going on. So with that being said, we're in a position right now where we need to come together in our community in order to be a part of and participate. Hey, I'm here in the room. And I'm not really seeing our organizations work together as succinctly as I would have hoped. And it's also hard to communicate with the organizations because for some reason there's, from what Denise is bringing in here, hierarchy. In terms of this, there's some other hierarchy form going on that I have to have. I don't have a college degree. I'm not in an educational institution. I'm one of the people who's extremely smart, who had to educate myself differently because of my disability, epilepsy, now MS and epilepsy, okay? And I was not, I didn't have any assistance to get myself any further, but I did through other areas, thankfully, my God-given talent, you know, and bright ideas and wanting to make a difference. The question is locally, my concern is how are we going to bring in the community and this concepts of smart cities, new technology, new development plans for the city, San Pablo Avenue corridor being redeveloped. I'm going to a meeting tomorrow on that. But my concern is where is the community that I can talk to? Because I don't seem to be having anybody to talk to, even when I come to panels or these things as an audience. I have a lot of information. I'm like you, Paul. I'm driven. I'm driven, and I wish I had a place to go with this.
Lainey and Paul, perhaps you would want to jump into it. I think.
Well, one thing is, you know, there have been lawsuits around the country about the kiosks that cities install, and they're supposed to be, you know, the next newest, bestest, shiniest thing. And those of us in the digital space have to work super hard to keep up. And like New York City, you know, these are public things with public money. They must be accessible. Now we have Victor, he's not, yeah. So you should really answer this question about smart cities, because you're the international smarts. I'm glad that you're, yeah, why don't you take it?
So I think when we think about the technology that's being built, people reintroduce their lack of awareness and understanding by deploying technologies that don't really fit everybody's needs. So I serve on the U.S. Federal Access Board, and it is a federal committee that develops regulations and guidelines. Those are legally binding rules that sort of create incentives and disincentives for the behavior. Now, the challenge with the technology is that unless we have a seat at the table, those innovations start moving so quickly, and they get deployed so quickly at such a large scale that it becomes difficult to undo the kind of exclusions that we've seen in the built environment being reproduced in the digital environment. So a lot of the work that Lainey's doing on the structured settlements is really important, because if you can create a clear understanding not only of what the needs are, but also how large and diverse the demographic is, and ultimately how innovative the solutions ultimately are once they include accessibility, then you start to see changes in the behavior of companies, and they're looking at innovation from an inclusion lens. So a lot of the great work that Tiffany's doing at Diversibility, Tiffany's right there, is really working with the technology companies and building up the awareness and the capacity and the understanding that these technologies are reshaping the way we live our lives, but is it going to reshape the way everybody lives their lives? Or just some of them, some of us, and then is it shaping us in a way that will continue to bring us more choices and more ability to exercise without our dreams, or is it going to just create more frustrations? Those of us that can't use kiosks or autonomous vehicles that aren't designed for everyone, or artificial intelligence that can't recognize my face because I don't have two nostrils. They're invisible, and so my face is not a real human face. So if I try to interact with a computer that requires facial recognition, I'm not even a human being. And I also have some people that might have an eye patch, or might be otherwise not have the same markers that trigger the technology to respond to your needs. So yeah, it's a big deal. $2 trillion should be invested by technology, by cities over the next 2 years on upgrading the digital infrastructure. And we have to make sure, like Lainey was saying, a lot of these are public funds. You need to be able to benefit the entire public. Thank you.
Ellen, your question was about the groups.
Yeah, but one quick thing to Victor. What's interesting is there's like this third-party proprietary sort of a thing over the kiosk. It's the same one that's already been sued that's going to be doing this rollout here. But it's because there's a distance between the city having some sort of responsibility, or is it the kiosk? Because it's strange that the city doesn't necessarily utilizes the resources here in Berkeley to actually, because there's enough organizations here in Berkeley for the city to be reaching out to, and it shouldn't be such a surprise that January, or no, yeah, sometime in January, we got the overview of the kiosks at one of our meetings with finding out they're rolling out in spring. And then when you talk about proprietary ownership, who's responsible for, it's sort of like they're using this three things aside from who's actually responsible to keep it as distance, like with the parking, out as distance as you can for anybody to have any responsibility for anything to be complained about in the ADA. Similar to parking here in Berkeley. We have a pass that somebody with a disability can apply for $15 at our garages to park for free. However, people who visit our community and other areas don't know that there's even a pass. Again, it's a third-party thing that separates it, where you can't really focus down on the fact of the ADA, and then you also run into persons with disabilities in Berkeley are not being accounted for because of this pass, because only drivers with disabilities that are using this pass in our city parking lots, then it says, oh, this is a disabled person who is parking here. But otherwise, if you have a disability, you pay normal price in the parking lot, whether or not, and nobody's checking to see who's utilizing the disabled parking spots. Just an example. It's like it's getting a little crazy with trying to hone it in.
Just to follow up on it, Gagan, the fact that you brought us together is, indicative of how important it is to be loud.
Yes.
And to be visible and to be, strategic and aware. And we've got different members of our community, some that are great being visible on the street, others that can infiltrate these conversations on the inside. I mean, we know the tactics.
Yes.
That have worked in the 70s and 80s, they continue to be the same tactics that continue to work. We have to have advocacy, research, policy, we have to be present, we have to leverage the media. I mean, we know a lot of these things. I mean, the fact that we're continuing to encounter these exclusions, it's just the fact that there is an embedded DNA or some kind of a concept that we're not thought of. People don't think of disability. As an urban planner, I see nobody builds a city trying to exclude people with disabilities. They just literally don't think about it. And so we have to give them an easy way.
Yes.
And if it's not that easy, we have to make it hard for them not to forget us.
Precisely. Yeah. That's why there's a need to have more of these kind of conversations, which are cross group, which are breaking the silos, as Lainey said, and here, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom out here. Your perspectives from all across.
We're not going to let you go home at the end of February, right? Everyone agree?
Yes. So, if you have any more burning question.
There's a question.
Yes.
I agree with about like, how do we bring the community together? Because I feel like we don't want in the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement, but I feel like right now we're going backwards to the point that I was born in 1979, and the 2000, and people are born with disabilities now. They don't care about our life. They
the fact that you are here, Denise is here, Neil is there, you know, it's, the knowledge transfer has to happen, and you have to learn from each other, and Denise has to teach you, and as you said, that this disability rights movement has to become a cohesive force, has to build bridges, has to collaborate among different factions, and fight with one voice, and achieve justice and fairness. Jim.
If I can give you my perspective on this, and I'm just one guy, okay? So I think, you know, you look at the legacy of our movement here. You know, why is CIL now some kind of organization that isn't doing anything in regards to providing community services like they did at their inception? And whereas you have to look at what DREDF's kind of mandate is and what they're doing. And I'm not saying that there isn't a need. There's an absolute freaking need, but it needs to be in hand with the work that they're doing along with other organizations. There is an absolute need for something. I'm hearing about these freaking kiosks for the first time right now. And I'm thinking, what can I do that won't land me in jail to stop them from being installed?
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's my lineage. That's my culture. This is what we do when people are pissing on us.
Yes.
Excuse my language. And so your point is very well taken, but I think that there has to be a discussion around what does it take to kind of make things more cohesive and a very, very quick response to these things. And I don't know what it is either, but you pique my, it's a question.
Denise, any thoughts for Sherer?
Not really. I think that, you know, I feel very old. And very tired. You know, I've been fighting this fight for a long time, and you know, I used to have a fantasy that, well, if I educate people and they get it and they'll educate people and we'll all be one big happy family. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't work that way. So, you know, I think that we need to rethink how we're gonna do this. And I see it happening not only in our community, but in the civil rights community, in the Me Too movement. So I think that our challenge for this point in time is to really think about how we can make it happen in a more permanent way. Good.
The biggest problem is that we're poor. Is that what you said? Yeah.
To speak. To think.
That's no problem.
We think we are poor.
Yes. Until we get over that, psychic on me.
So, thank you, Neil, for that input.
Yes.
We could have this conversation for time immemorial, because it's like this conversation can just continue forever and ever, because there are so many complicated issues, and as the idea of this particular panel discussion was to perhaps reignite the spark which Berkeley had during the time of when Denise and Neil and Jim and Lainey and Paul were all vibrant and active and trying to change the world.
Wait a second here.
We're vibrant. And let me continue. Let me continue and finish the whole thing. And take it back. Take 2 steps back.
You can't get out of this.
No, because the thing is this, that here I am, and here we are, you know, like as Sherer is mentioning, there has to be this incredible moment wherein we learn from all these people, we learn from all these voices, we understand perspectives from different angles, from the angle of filmmaking, law, higher education, activism, and we mobilize with each other. We try to find avenues of collaboration, cooperation, and this is just a conversation starter. And I would invite all of you to have much more comprehensive conversations. I would invite all of you to engage in much more cross-cultural, cross-group dialogue, as Helen was mentioning, breaking down the silos. And thanks so much for coming here. I really appreciate the fact that you people took out time in this cold Berkeley evening and came for this event. For me, it's warm and nice, and because Oslo, it's minus 15 degrees Celsius right now. So for me, this is springtime or summertime. But for you people, you took time out. Thanks so much for coming here. Thanks for this incredible panel, brilliant people who took time from their busy schedule. Thanks for our sponsors, VSPA, whom I mentioned, Visiting Scholars Postdoc Affairs people, Yvette and Kimberly, who funded this event, along with Karen and the Robert and Colin Disability Cluster Chair. Thank you, everybody, for this evening.
Quick question. I was wondering if the panel could just close with something that they feel hopeful about, or what gives you hope?
Yes.
So that we can
Fantastic, sure. Please give hope. The last butterfly which flew out of the Pandora's box. Please.
I got one.
Lainey.
Helen Keller. Nothing can be accomplished without hope and confidence. And she was an optimist, and she has some great quotes of optimism. I, in my book, write about the value of optimism in doing the work that I do, because if we don't believe in ourselves, that we're going to be successful in the very long game, like Jim said. So there's hope.
Yeah. Jim?
All is Look,
Your dark night.
Yeah. I need my minute. Anyway, the things that are giving me hope right now are seeing things within the industry that I work in which after discussing with Sundance for many, many years about the lack of accessibility at the festival, they've really taken some really big strides in the last year, including they had a filmmakers lodge that was not wheelchair accessible, and now there's an elevator.
Wow.
And that they have a fellowship that now includes filmmakers with disabilities, and I'm seeing this happening at the San Francisco Film Society also and such. I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful when I see Netflix advertising for casting of people with disabilities to play roles of people with disabilities, and that this seems to have gone to a point where hopefully we're going to see we're going to see more people being able to build their careers so they are the stars, people with disabilities who are the stars that are the box office draws versus having to have a Joaquin Phoenix play a quadriplegic. So that's what I'm hopeful for.
Inclusion writer. Paul?
Yeah.
So I believe that long arc does bend towards justice. And I do believe that things are much better and different today than they were 40 years ago. But, when the last three speakers were raising the issue of how to keep the revolution alive, this is a problem that faces every revolution in history.
Yes.
How do you keep it alive? And some people with disabilities are more medically fragile than the population as a whole, and we are losing them. I miss the advocate that Larry Paradise, who left us 2 years ago. I still miss Larry, and I think of all the people with post-polio syndrome who were leaders of the civil rights movement, who are now, getting up in the years, and I think that we, the disability rights revolutionaries, really, really need to seriously think about succession planning. We need to make succession planning an explicit objective and get on with it.
Denise, our last word for hope.
I'm looking forward to Crip
So am I.
Absolutely. So let us join our hands for this wonderful panel and this beautiful evening. Of its time. Truly special. Thank you.